You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again.
Have you ever got a text message, and that text message was one line, and it says, "Call me as soon as possible"? And that's all it says. Doesn't say anything about what they want. Just call me as soon as possible. And what do? Well, you get your phone and you dial the number, and the number rings and nobody answers. And it's really disturbing because you're wondering what in the world they want to talk about. I've got a lot of those, and it really, really irritates me. And this is another one. A message on the phone, on the answering machine, that says, "I have bad news." I have bad news. And when we hear that, we think the worst. This past week, I got a telephone call, a voicemail, that says, "Brent, please call me. I have bad news." Well, fortunately, the first time I rang the number, they answered. And what had happened, a friend of mine at another church had passed away. I knew he was sick, but I didn't think he was sick unto death. People who knew him called him the big man. The reason they called him this was not because he was very influential, had lots of money. That wasn't the reason. The reason they called him the big man was he was a big man. Physically, he was a big man. But he also was a big man in terms of kindness. If anybody needed anything, he was the first one there to help them. He was a big man because he was big in the church. He was at church every Sunday. He was a really close friend of mine. And when I heard that news, my heart just sank. And I began remembering times that we had together. We would make apple butter once a year. Now, if you ever made apple butter, that's a hard job, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the conversation, not the work. And he would always tell the funniest stories. And when he would tell those stories, some people would laugh and some people wouldn't. But he would always laugh. And he laughed all over. He just laughed all over. I remember if he met anyone, a stranger or anybody that he didn't know, his first words were, "And how are you doing today?" Now that seems simple and insignificant, but the way he said it, you could tell he really cared. His death is bad news. Bad news to his family, to his community, to all the people that knew him. It's bad news to me. And you know what? In this day and time, people cannot gather and celebrate his life. They can't celebrate the life of the big man. What do we do when loved ones and friends pass away? How do we grieve? It's hard. It hurts. We just want to see them again. We just want to hear their voice again. I've experienced that a number of times this year. Doesn't matter how long they have passed, we still miss them. I know in my bedroom, I have an old hat. It's just an old hat. And it's the hat my father used to wear. And he's been gone for a long time. This past year, I lost my sister-in-law. She was more than a sister-in-law. She was a friend. She was a very good friend. And what I do is I have a couple of pins that they gave in her memorial service, and they're laying on my desk. And I look at those, and I remember her. You know, you never get over the death of a loved one, a family member. You never get over it. What you do is you learn to live with the hurt, the sorrow, and the pain. Death is darkness, and it's a shadow that hovers over each and every one of us. Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. They gathered in an upper room and they celebrated the feast. And after they had finished the meal, Jesus says, I have some bad news. He says, one of you will betray me. Bad news. John was sitting beside him. John was known as the beloved disciple. Nobody really knows why, but that's what they called John, the beloved disciple. And he looked at Jesus and he said, who is it? Who is it? And Jesus says, it's the one that when I dip the bread into the wine, I hand to him. And he hands it to Judas Iscariot. Jesus looks at Judas and says, what you do quickly. And Judas leaves. They finish the meal, and Jesus does something that we need to remember. He washes the disciples' feet, each and every one of them. And he says, if you're to be my disciples, you are to be a servant of others. They sing a song, and then they go to a garden nearby known as Gethsemane. Jesus and the 12 walk into the garden, and Jesus says, you all stay here and pray. You stay here and pray. And then he takes Peter, James, and John a little farther, and he says, you stay here and pray. And he walks up to a rock. Jesus walks up to a rock. And he falls on the rock. He lies on the rock. And the scripture tells us that his sweat was like blood, like drops of blood. And he looks into heaven and he says, is there another way? And then he says, not my will, but your will. Just then, over the hill comes lights. And the lights come upon Jesus, and it's Judas with soldiers. And Judas walks up and kisses the Lord. And Jesus says, you betray your Lord with a kiss. They tie his hands and lead him off. And all night he bounces from one court to another. And they charge him, and they find him guilty. Of what? They didn't know then, and we don't know until this day. They lead Jesus to a mount called Calvary, and they put him upon a cross. And I know that words cannot describe what happened. Agony and pain and suffering. The bad news is Jesus dies. It's a Sabbath, and they take the body down, but they can't prepare the body for burial. It is against the Sabbath rule. And there is silence. There is silence for 3 days. It had to be Mary. You remember Mary. Mary is the one that sat at Jesus' feet. Listen to his voice, listen to his teachings. That's all she wanted to do. It had to be Mary, walking down that road early the first morning of the week. And as she was walking down that road, I wonder what she was thinking. Everything was finished, everything was done. He saved others, but now he's dead. She walks down the path, and as she got near the tomb, she noticed the stone was rolled away. Odd. As she got closer, she noticed a man standing on a mount. And she looks at him and she says, "Where is the body that was in that tomb?" And the man says, "Mary. Mary." She knew that voice. She knew that voice possibly better than anyone. And she looks at the man and she says, "Lord." And she runs to him. And she's about to embrace him. And Jesus says, "Mary, remember social distancing." No, he didn't say that. He said, "Mary, don't touch me. I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go and tell my disciples and Peter that I will go ahead of them and they will see me in Galilee." What does this mean? What does all this mean? You've probably heard this story time and time again, but what does it mean? This was no benefit to God. God didn't need to see this. This was no benefit to Jesus. Jesus didn't need to see this. This was for our benefit, for everyone that has ever stepped foot upon this planet. This is good news. Jesus said, "Even though you die, you shall live," believing in his name and his teachings. Not only did he rise, we will also rise. Amen.
The silence is quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. That we have each other, and for that we have each each other. And we will rise, we will rise, we will rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times.